Taliban forces entered the heart of the Afghan capital, Kabul, today, the culmination of a rapid advance and retaking of control almost exactly 2 decades after they were ousted from power. Fighters were filmed inside the presidential palace after Ashraf Ghani, now the former president, fled the country. Afghans and foreign nationals have been trying to get on planes at Kabul airport, where international troops have been involved in evacuations, but security there is reported to be fragile. The latest developments came after the Taliban moved through one Afghan province after another in recent days and headed towards the capital. Our first report is from our diplomatic correspondent, Paul Adams.
Afghanistan has new masters. 20 years after their first experiment in power came to a shattering end, the Taliban are back, hours after arriving in Kabul, sitting at the president's desk.
To understand how these men returned to Kabul 20 years later, we have to go back much further. Before the black flags, before the American invasion, before the war that would consume a generation, the Taliban were something much simpler: students. Their name itself comes from the Pashto word for students, and their movement was born not in a palace, but in the chaos left behind by years of war. Afghanistan had already been fighting for more than a decade. The Soviet invasion of 1979 had transformed the country into a battlefield. Mujahideen fighters resisted the Soviet-backed government, while foreign powers supplied money, weapons, and political support. In 1989, Soviet troops finally left. But peace did not follow. Instead, rival factions fought for control of a country exhausted by war. In 1992, the government in Kabul collapsed. The Mujahideen entered the capital, but they did not agree on what should come next. Rival commanders turned their weapons on one another. Kabul was shelled. Civilians fled. Across the south, local warlords controlled roads, towns, and checkpoints. For many Afghans, the promise of liberation had become another cycle of violence. It was in this atmosphere that a new movement began to emerge around Kandahar in 1994. Its members included religious students and men from rural southern Afghanistan. Their message was simple: restore order, disarm the warlords, and impose their interpretation of Islamic law. The movement gathered followers quickly, and unlike many factions before them, the Taliban appeared to offer something Afghanistan desperately wanted: an end to chaos. Their leader was a former Mujahideen commander and religious figure named Mullah Muhammad Omar. Around him, the movement expanded from Kandahar across the south. Town after town fell. Some communities welcomed the Taliban because they were tired of criminality and competing militias. Others submitted because the alternative was continued war. The movement was gaining something more valuable than territory: momentum. By 1995, the Taliban were approaching Kabul. Their advance was not unstoppable. They suffered defeats, regrouped, and fought their way forward. But the balance was changing. In September 1996, Taliban forces entered Kabul. The government collapsed. Former President Mohammad Najibullah, who had remained in the city under United Nations protection, was captured and killed. The Taliban had taken the capital. For the first time, the students were no longer rebels moving across the countryside. They were rulers. They proclaimed the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan and imposed a strict system based on their interpretation of Islam. Women and girls faced severe restrictions. Political opponents were suppressed. Religious minorities were targeted. Public punishments became part of the regime's image. Afghanistan had order, but it was an order built on coercion. The Taliban did not begin as a conventional army. They emerged from a generation shaped by war, religious schools, and the collapse of Afghanistan's old political order. The word Taliban simply means students. But these students entered a country where power had become fragmented, armed, and brutal. Their promise was simple: restore order. And in a country exhausted by war, that promise was powerful. By the mid-1990s, Taliban were no longer just a movement of students. They were becoming a military force. City after city fell. In 1996, they entered Kabul and declared a new Islamic Emirate. Their rule was deeply controversial, especially over restrictions imposed on women and political opponents. But the important point was this: the Taliban had transformed themselves from a religious movement into the government of Afghanistan. Then came September 11, 2001. The Taliban regime became inseparable from the global fight against al-Qaeda. After refusing to hand over Osama bin Laden, the Taliban government was overthrown by a U.S.-led coalition. Kabul fell quickly. The emirate disappeared, and for a moment it seemed that the Taliban story had ended. The movement simply changed shape. Its fighters disappeared into the countryside, across borders, and into networks built during decades of war. The Taliban were no longer governing Afghanistan. They were fighting to return. Meanwhile, the United States and its allies were trying to build something entirely different: a new Afghan state, a new army, and a new political system. For years, the Taliban remained a persistent insurgency rather than a conventional army. They attacked government forces, foreign troops, and strategic targets while building influence in rural areas. The longer the war lasted, the harder the central question became: could military power permanently prevent the Taliban from returning? After nearly 2 decades, Washington increasingly faced a different calculation.
92 or X-ray 92. I think we just hit an IED. I'll copy.
This is Baraki Rajan in Afghanistan's Logar province. It's the key battleground in the fight against the insurgency. This year, a record number of foreign fighters have flooded the area, including many from Pakistan.
The advice just had a IED go off at our TCP location. I'll copy. Hey, do we have a casualty? Yeah. Hey, Comanche X-ray, Comanche 92, Roger. We have a casualty at this time. Thomas, you're gonna be all right, bud.
These US soldiers were part of a patrol checking vehicles for weapons and ammunition. The bomb blast, probably set off remotely, hit 21-year-old Private Ryan Thomas.
All right, Tommy, just gonna trust, all right? Where was it? Doc, what do you need to do?
He has deep lacerations to his legs. The platoon medic patches him up. He stuffs gauze into the wounds and applies tourniquets to stem the bleeding as they wait for an emergency helicopter.
I'm gonna need to get to that leg. Cranking it, Tom.
Hey, is that the only casualty? Yeah, roger that.
The soldiers were patrolling without their Afghan colleagues. The threat of insider attacks led to joint operations being scaled back, but as the US draws down, the Afghans are being pushed to the front. Within an hour, Thomas will be in surgery. He's lucky to have only soft tissue damage. For him, this war is over. And soon, in 2014, it will also be over for the NATO combat forces. But for the Afghans, there's no such relief.
In 2020, the United States and the Taliban signed the Doha Agreement. The deal opened the way for the withdrawal of American forces and direct negotiations over Afghanistan's future. The Taliban had not retaken Kabul. They had not defeated the United States on a conventional battlefield, but they had survived long enough to negotiate the departure of the most powerful military coalition in the country. As foreign forces withdrew, the Afghan state began to unravel with extraordinary speed. Provinces fell. Government forces surrendered or disappeared. Political authority collapsed faster than many expected. Then, on August 15, 2021, Taliban fighters entered Kabul. 20 years after being driven from power, they were back, not as insurgents outside the capital, as the new masters of Afghanistan. The images were striking because they compressed an entire era into a few days. American troops leaving, Afghan institutions collapsing, and Taliban fighters walking through buildings once controlled by their enemies. But the return to power was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new question. What happens when a movement built to fight a government suddenly has to become the government? That is the Taliban story in its simplest form. A movement of students became rulers. Rulers became fugitives. Fugitives became insurgents. Insurgents became negotiators, and negotiators returned to Kabul. The extraordinary part is not simply that the Taliban survived 20 years of war. It is that, after 20 years, they found themselves facing the hardest challenge yet, governing Afghanistan.
ای وطن ای مادر تاریخ ساز ای وطن